All right, so now I'm going to pick up Metaphysics Book 4, chapters 3 and 4. So one last thought from chapter 2 is important in the very last paragraph. So what we're trying to do is get to the first principles and sources. And it's worth knowing that all other kinds of knowledge take certain principles and sources of being as a hypothesis, as something that they depend upon without really having proven it, or perhaps even fully understanding it, in order to get to talk about the kinds of things that they want to. So like the geometer talks about contrariety, oneness, sameness, difference. In order to make geometrical proofs, you have to be able to say these triangles are the same, they're different, or they're different. This is one triangle that you're splitting into two, etc. So the geometer starts with the assumption that you kind of know what that is, and even sometimes just a definition of what we're going to call oneness or what we're going to call sameness or contrariety, or what we're going to call whole and partness. So that's fine. That's good that the geometer does it, but it's a different kind of knowledge. So the hope would be that instead of taking being as a hypothesis, we could reach the source of being and see what it was on its own terms. Because I'll do the kind of thing that all the different kinds of knowledges, we're just too busy doing their own thing with. Ethics depends on a notion of oneness, of sameness, of difference, of goodness. And it had to move on and take care of what it meant in the now and what it meant in terms of action. But we need also to know what these things are so that we're not just basing things like ethics, politics, and geometry on clouds, on a fiction. So, okay, so in chapter 3, we're saying that it's the philosopher's job to deal with this. We know in some way that thinghood or whatever makes an independent thing is prior to all the relations that it has of color, place, time. But it looks as though also that whatever we're going to inquire about, we're talking about stuff that it is different from nature. We talked about nature in the context of the physics readings that we did. Aristotle says that most people go wrong because they sort of just focus on nature as the totality of being. But the problem is, he says this on page 58, at 1005a 34, there is something that is still higher than the natural. The natural, the organic, the visibly existing is a kind of being, but it's not all being. There is something like things like oneness, contrariety, etc. These things transcend the natural world, even though they are also part of it. So that's what we're trying to do. So if that's what we're trying to do to get to the top, to something that's not simply hypothesized about, something that is certainly present in nature, but also stretches beyond it, then we should be trying to get to something that's non-hypothetical, something that isn't simply proved, that maybe I guess you would hope that we could prove it or witness it in some way. But there is a problem with this. And classically, and he mentioned this in book 1, it makes all the difference if you are going, book 1 of the ethics, if you're going up to first principles or reasoning down from first principles. So one way of thinking about this is that this is a difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning goes up to first principles, and deductive reasoning starts with certain principles as a given and deduces further truths from them. So if we're trying to get to the first principles and sources, if we're trying to go up to first principles, you can't actually prove them in a deductive sense, because then you would be taking something as a given in order to get a conclusion from it. So it's a problem, because it looks like typically we sort of hold, like our image of what a proof is deductive. You start with something true and you find out a conclusion, you draw a conclusion from it. But if we want to get to the top, we're going to have to use a different kind of reasoning. We're going to have to go through experience and our observation and our witnessing and compare our thoughts and try to in some way lead ourselves up to whatever the first source is. So in chapter 3, he gives an example of something that he calls both an opinion, a source of other principles, a principle in its own right, but something that's not a hypothesis. It's not simply unproven that we're taking for granted. But it looks like it has to be the foundation of our thinking, and that it is one most important foundation of our thinking, even though we can't deductively prove it. We can't demonstrate that it is the case. He says there's a way to give a refutation of the alternative, that it isn't true. And it's not going to be, people don't always find it satisfying, again, because I think our prejudice is towards demonstrative knowledge. But here he has to show you what we can call, for our purposes, the principle of non-contradiction, that something simply can't be at the same time, in the same respect, and not be the same thing at the same time, in the same respect. You can't be both be a human being and not a human being at the same time, in the same respect, in the same way. At one time, the materials that you were could have been something different, and another time you might die, you will die, and then you won't be quite human in quite the same way anymore. But right now, the ability to say, that's a human being, and have that be meaningful, and have it not also be true simultaneously that it's not the case that this thing is a human being, is the foundation of logical thinking and any kind of talking at all, is his claim. So the principle of non-contradiction. And you find this at the top of page 59. And he kind of just states that it's not possible for the same thing at the same time, both to belong and not to belong to the same thing in the same respect. So this is a great one for your notes. One example from Plato, people joke and they say, oh, look, I have a spinning top. And you say it's moving and it's not moving. Why? Because it's moving on one axis and not the other. Like this part is staying still, but this part is moving around. So the idea is that in any existing thing, all existing things, it's never possible for the same thing to be moving and not moving at the same time in the same respect. There has to be a fundamental determinacy to being, or else thought's not possible, communication with other human beings is not possible, and really existence itself is not possible as well. And he says one more thing from chapter 3 at the very end, last paragraph. If one thing can't be and not be at the same time in the same respect, that also kind of means that I can't have an opinion that's true about something. Sorry, I can't have an opinion that something is the case and also have it be an opinion that it's not the case. This one's a little bit harder because it does look like we often enjoy saying, oh, the cup is both one and many, or the pencil's moving and not moving. We say it as a sentence, but then the question is, can it really even be a thought? And even just sort of like an ordinary thought, like an opinion I have. For Aristotle, opinion isn't what you may have learned as like a value judgment. It is in a way like a reasonable attempt to know and state what you currently believe to be the truth about something, to be the case about what something is. And so you can certainly have confused opinions, and you can find contradictions in your own thinking, but it might be impossible, if Aristotle's correct, really to, at the same time, think something as both is and is not in the same way. I can think it is not now, and now I can think it is, and now I can think it is not. But to put those two thoughts together at the same time, it seems like it might be impossible. So now in chapter 4, it becomes clear, though, that we do have a problem. He says in 3, it's so obvious, this is just the case. But then it also kind of turns out that a lot of people claim that it's not. The people in Greek philosophy who do claim that it's not are legion. So we have to examine why they're willing to say this and how I would explain to them that they're wrong. And again, as I was just saying, you can't really demonstrate it in the same way that other things can be demonstrated because it is a source. It's something we build on rather than build to. So Aristotle points out, sort of referring back to book 2, it is a mark of our ability, it's a mark of our education, if we've been well educated, to understand what needs a proof and what doesn't, to be able to distinguish between the need for demonstrative proof in mathematics and something more like an inductive approach in metaphysics. So you can't have a demonstration of absolutely everything, since it would go on to infinity, so that not even so would there be a demonstration? Because it would be just continuing forever and not prove definitively, it would always just continue. Or continue up when, as the case may be. We'll keep proving further principles were necessary, and then more, and then more, and then more. It would just sort of make knowledge impossible. And it goes to show that I can't, if I really want something to be proven, or if I really want, what I really want is for it to be real and for me to recognize that it's real, and an infinite demonstration would not achieve that. But so take a look at page 60 at 1106A 13. Some people, interestingly, like maybe the pre-Socratic philosopher Cratylus, would attempt to claim that speech and reason, and also this principle of non-contradiction, were meaningless by simply not talking. Cratylus is known for moving his little finger, which in itself is kind of a problem for this argument. You can't talk to somebody who believes that there's no such thing as reason or determinate thing. Like if they're not talking at all, you just have to kind of let them go. There's no way of engaging with them. And Aristotle says the person like that is just kind of like a plant. Like they're just there. Like the problem is we want to talk to other people. And so people do show up and they do want to have this argument and they do want to prove to you this impossible thing. And for these people, that's when we have to try to refute them and show that what they're doing itself is involving themselves in an impossibility. So he says, how we start this kind of argument is not to demand that we prove once and for all that this principle of non-contradiction is true, because maybe then we're actually also kind of begging the question, assuming what we're trying to do from the beginning. But that what he says must mean something to both himself and someone else, for this is necessary if he's going to say anything. For if this is not the case, there would be no argument with such a person, neither by himself in relation to himself, nor with anyone else. So that's the idea that if I haven't in some way agreed that I can speak, that things are one way or the other, then I can't really enter into a conversation at all. And really just the attempt, the willingness to try to talk to someone does mean that we're trying to talk about something specific. And I've already sort of admitted in a way that that's kind of what I wanted. Like say we were having an argument about what a cup was, and you were insisting that it was a banana. People love to make, this argument about like what's really a sandwich or not. Annoying people love to make that argument. But so like, you could say there's no such thing as a cup, but then even to sort of enter into the conversation at all is to have some kind of willingness that there would be some determinate thing, one thing that I am thinking of or pointing to when I say a cup, that would have a real being and a consistency and a thinghood that I could talk about. He says, if the person shows up and attempts to argue that the thing is, thing both is and isn't in the same time in the same respect, in a way, just by opening their mouth to talk, they've already lost because they've admitted that reason is worth it, that convincing me of one specific thing is possible, and therefore they refuted themselves by accidentally joining an argument. There's one more, in this long chapter, there's a lot of different ways he has many different ways of refuting this argument, but let me talk about just briefly the next one, the second argument he gives it roughly 1006A 29. So it looks like to say that something is or is not really means something definite. So that when I'm saying a human being, what I mean is just that it is one thing, that we are both thinking of roughly the same thing at the same time. So if human being signifies one thing, let this be two-footed animal. Just a joke definition for the sake of this argument. Now, by signifying one thing, I mean this. If this is a human being, then if anything is a human being, this will be its being human. So I'm not even claiming that human beings necessarily exist, but if they do, this is what it would mean to be that. Even if I don't have a full definition or an articulation of it, I am pointing to something that we're both trying to figure out what it is. So of course, like, to be human could mean three separate things, but then I can identify them and then I would have the same problem again. Is the first category of the thing that I'm claiming that it means, does that have some one definite meaning? So, and we're still trying to say yes. Because the problem is any one name for anything can't be an infinite number of things, because everything else would mean everything else. Later on in the chapter he says, well, if everything just means anything, then it would be like human being means a battleship and a horse and a board. It's that important that it does have some kind of definite meaning. He says it's not possible to think without thinking one thing. So if thinking is possible, one could set down one name for this thing. So this is a nice way in which oneness and beingness sort of do seem to overlap and be a part of each other. When we think, we are thinking of some one thing, even if we don't have the same name for it, or even if we aren't thinking of the same thing. If we're really just, if you mean a banana and I mean a human, but we're both thinking of one thing, just we have to come to correspondence with each other about the kind of thing that we're trying to identify. And certainly he also says, I don't mean like that human being means like the accidental attributes of it, like being educated or pale or being, or like wearing glasses, all these things. Certainly no, I mean the thinghood itself. I mean, whatever underlies all the accidental relationships to the thinghood of the thing. So that's the idea. You can't say that something both is and is not in the same way at the same time, because to do so, you destroy the possibility of thought. And something that seems to follow from that is that whenever I'm thinking about something, I am thinking about something definite, even if I don't understand what I mean. And that definiteness, that oneness of the thing, is a sign that there is some kind of form, some kind of thinghood that does underlie the structure of being, would be worth finding more about.